The wind howled through the desolate countryside as dark clouds loomed over the horizon. Rick Houston, a sturdy black cat with sleek fur and piercing yellow eyes, moved like a shadow through the overgrown fields. His muscles ached from the miles he had already traveled, but his determination burned brighter than ever. He had to keep going. The scent of his old home had long since faded, lost in the rain and mud, but his heart knew the way. Every step forward was a step closer to the family he had lost. Weeks ago, Rick's world had been shattered. His owners, the only people he had ever known, had moved away, leaving him behind in a place that was not his home. Strangers had taken him in, fed him, but it wasn't the same. He longed for the familiar scent of his family, the sound of their voices, the warmth of their touch. So one night, under the cover of darkness, he made his decision. He would find them, no matter how far they had gone. As he padded down an empty dirt road, the first challenge of his journey revealed itself. A roaring river stood between him and the direction he needed to go. The bridge was far in the distance, but Rick had no time to waste. He edged closer to the water, his sharp eyes scanning for a way across. The current was fierce, churning with recent rains, but Rick wasn't a cat who backed down easily. He crouched, calculating the distance to a half-submerged log, and with a powerful leap, he landed on the slippery surface. For a moment, he balanced, claws gripping tightly, but then the log shifted. A rush of cold water splashed against him, soaking his sleek black fur. His heart pounded as he leapt to another rock, then another, barely dodging the surging current. Finally, with a final desperate bound, he reached the other side. Dripping wet but victorious, he shook himself off, his piercing eyes locked on the path ahead. Rick wasn't just any cat, he was a survivor, and nothing was going to stop him from finding his family. Rick's paws pressed into the cold pavement as he ventured deeper into the unknown. The suburban streets he once knew had faded into the distance, replaced by endless stretches of road, towering trees, and eerie silence. The wind howled through the trees, rustling the leaves as Rick's sharp green eyes scanned the darkness for any sign of shelter. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten since breakfast that morning. Determined, he moved forward, his sleek black fur blending into the shadows as he crept along a row of houses. The scent of food drifted through the air, drawing him toward a backyard where a metal dish sat on a porch. He leaped onto the wooden steps and sniffed cautiously. It was dog food, far from his usual meals, but hunger left no room for preference. He took a few bites before the deep growl of a territorial dog sent him bolting into the night. His heart pounded as he sprinted through alleyways, dodging garbage cans and puddles, until the barking faded behind him. For the first time in his life, Rick was truly alone. There were no familiar voices calling his name, no warm bed waiting for him, only the vast, open world stretching before him. But he couldn't stop. Somewhere, miles away, his family was out there, and he had to find them. As dawn broke, Rick found himself on the outskirts of the city, where the pavement gave way to dirt roads and vast fields. The morning light cast long shadows as he cautiously approached a farm. The smell of hay and livestock filled the air, mingling with the scent of something more promising: food. A rusted tin dish sat near a barn, scraps of meat left behind by another animal. Rick hesitated for only a moment before darting forward, scarfing down the remains. Just as he was licking his paws clean, movement caught his eye. A towering orange tabby cat, muscular and scarred from years of street life, emerged from the barn. His golden eyes locked onto Rick with a mix of curiosity and challenge. Rick lowered his body, instinctively ready to flee, but the older cat didn't attack. Instead, he sat down, his tail flicking lazily. "You're not from around here," the tabby seemed to say with a slow blink. Rick, unsure of how to respond, simply stared back. The tabby stretched, unimpressed. "If you're gonna survive out here, you need to be smarter," he seemed to warn before turning and disappearing into the barn's shadows. Rick took a deep breath, his heart still pounding. He was beginning to realize that this journey was going to be much harder than he ever imagined. But as he gazed up at the sky, the wind whispering through the trees, he knew one thing for certain. No matter how far he had to go, he wasn't giving up. And so, he continued onward, his paws carrying him toward the unknown, toward the impossible, toward home. Rick pressed on, his muscles aching, his sleek black fur coated in dust and grime. The farm was far behind him now, the memory of the old tabby's warning lingering in his mind. The world outside his home was harsher than he had ever imagined. Hunger clawed at his stomach, exhaustion tugged at his legs, but he forced himself to keep moving. His family was out there, and every step, no matter how painful, brought him closer to them. The landscape had changed. The open fields gave way to a desolate stretch of highway, an endless ribbon of asphalt that seemed to stretch forever. Cars and trucks roared past, their headlights slicing through the early morning mist. The air smelled of burning rubber and oil, so different from the fresh scent of home. Rick stayed low, his sharp green eyes darting left and right as he scouted for a safe way to cross. Then a sound froze him in place, a loud honk. A truck was barreling toward him, the engine growling like an angry beast. Panic surged through Rick as he dashed forward, his paws pounding against the hard pavement. The headlights grew larger, blinding him. His breath caught. He wasn't going to make it. With every ounce of strength he had, Rick lunged forward just as the truck roared past, missing him by inches. He landed hard on the gravel shoulder, rolling to a stop. His heart pounded in his chest, his entire body trembling. The deafening roar of the vehicle faded into the distance, leaving him lying there, panting, alive. But he had no time to rest. He needed to get away from the road, away from the endless stream of metal beasts that could crush him in an instant. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs wobbling beneath him, and darted toward the trees. The forest welcomed him with its quiet stillness, a stark contrast to the chaos of the road. Towering pines stretched high above, their branches swaying gently. The air was damp, thick with the scent of moss and earth. Here he could breathe. Here he could hide. Rick padded deeper into the woods, stepping carefully over fallen branches and damp leaves. He needed food, water, shelter, anything to keep him going. As he wandered, he spotted a small creek, its clear waters trickling over smooth stones. Relief washed over him as he leaned down, lapping up the cool, fresh water. Just as he began to feel a hint of comfort, a rustling noise sent his fur bristling. Something was watching him. His ears swiveled, his body tensing. Then, from behind the thick underbrush, a pair of glowing yellow eyes emerged. A coyote. The wild dog's gaze locked onto Rick, its thin frame tense with hunger. It took a slow step forward, lips curling back to reveal sharp teeth. Rick's heart pounded. He had survived the road, but now he faced an even deadlier threat. He had no time to think, only to react. With a sudden burst of energy, Rick turned and bolted through the trees, the coyote lunging after him. Twigs snapped, leaves rustled, the chase was on. Rick zigzagged through the forest, leaping over logs, pushing his aching body to its limit. The coyote was fast, but Rick was desperate. He couldn't stop. Up ahead, he spotted a fallen tree with a small gap beneath its massive trunk. Without hesitation, he dove forward, sliding into the narrow space just as the coyote snapped at his tail. Rick flattened himself against the earth, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The coyote snarled and clawed at the opening, but it was too small for the predator to reach him. Minutes passed. The coyote, realizing it had lost, let out a low growl before retreating into the darkness. Rick remained frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. When silence finally settled over the forest, he slowly crawled out, his body shaking. He had survived again, but the world wasn't going to make this easy for him. He was just a cat, alone in a vast and dangerous wilderness. And yet, as he gazed up at the moonlit sky, he reminded himself of why he was doing this. He wasn't just any cat. He was Rick Houston. He had a family waiting for him, and no matter what dangers stood in his way, he was going to find them. Rick Houston had faced danger after danger. Starvation, exhaustion, and the near-fatal chase with the coyote. But as he crept out from his hiding place beneath the fallen tree, his body still trembling, he knew there was no turning back. He had come too far. He had survived too much. He had to keep going. The forest stretched endlessly ahead of him, the towering trees swaying with the whisper of the night wind. The scent of damp earth filled the air, mixing with the distant aroma of something familiar, food. His sharp nose twitched. Hunger gnawed at his insides, reminding him that survival wasn't just about moving forward. He needed strength. Guided by instinct, Rick followed the scent, weaving through the dense underbrush. His paws, sore and raw from days of travel, barely made a sound as he padded forward. Then, he saw it, a small clearing with a worn-down wooden cabin, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. A rusty trash can stood just outside the front porch, its lid slightly ajar. The scent of discarded meat scraps made his mouth water. Rick hesitated. He had spent his life in a warm, loving home, fed from a clean bowl by gentle hands. The idea of scavenging from a trash can felt foreign beneath him. But survival didn't care about pride. With one last glance toward the house, he crept forward, his tail low, ears pricked for any sign of movement. With a soft leap, he landed beside the trash can and pawed at the lid. A piece of roasted chicken, dry but still edible, tumbled onto the dirt. Rick hungrily snatched it up, chewing quickly. The salty, smoky flavor filled his mouth, sending a shiver of relief through his body. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Just as he licked his lips, the cabin door creaked open. Rick froze. A large shadow stretched across the porch, illuminated by the dim yellow glow from inside. A man stepped out, his boots thudding heavily against the wood. He was tall, wrapped in a thick flannel jacket, his beard scruffy and unkempt. His sharp blue eyes locked onto Rick instantly. "Well, well," the man muttered, stepping closer. "What do we have here?" Rick's fur bristled. He took a cautious step back, ready to bolt. "Easy there, fella," the man said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He crouched down, extending a weathered hand. "Ain't seen a cat like you round here before. You lost?" Rick didn't move. His sharp instincts told him to flee, but something in the man's voice gave him pause. He didn't sound angry. He didn't look like a threat. Still, trusting humans was a risk, and Rick had already risked enough. The man sighed, shaking his head. "All right, suit yourself," he muttered, standing up. He turned and walked back toward the cabin, pushing the door open. Just before stepping inside, he glanced over his shoulder. "If you change your mind, there's food and warmth in here." With that, the door clicked shut, leaving Rick alone in the cold. He stood there for a moment, staring at the door. His body ached for warmth, his stomach begged for more food. But he knew better. He had one goal: finding his real family. He couldn't afford to get comfortable. Rick turned away from the cabin and slipped back into the forest. The night was long, the wind sharp and biting against his thin fur. He kept moving, forcing one paw in front of the other, the taste of roasted chicken still lingering on his tongue. His mind drifted to his owners, the soft touch of their hands, the way they called his name, the warmth of their home. He couldn't let himself stop. Hours passed. The trees began to thin, the sounds of the forest fading. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A flickering glow, the unmistakable shimmer of streetlights. A town. Civilization. Rick's heart pounded. He was getting closer. The journey wasn't over yet. But for the first time since he had started, hope burned in his chest. His family was out there, and he was going to find them. Rick Houston's paws ached with every step, but the sight of distant streetlights gave him strength. The endless wilderness was behind him now. Ahead lay roads, houses, people, civilization. He was close. So close he could almost hear his family's voices calling his name. His black fur, once sleek and groomed, was now matted with dust and grime. He was thinner than he had ever been, his muscles weak from exhaustion, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The town stretched before him like a dream. Cars rumbled past on the main road, headlights flashing in the darkness. Storefronts glowed softly, their windows fogged from the cold. The scent of fresh bread and grilled meat drifted from a nearby restaurant, teasing his empty stomach. But Rick ignored it. He had to focus. His home, his family, where were they? His golden eyes scanned the streets, searching for something, anything familiar. Then a wave of confusion struck him. Everything looked different. The roads were unfamiliar, the houses weren't the ones he remembered. Had he taken a wrong turn? Had he come all this way, only to be lost again? A gust of wind rustled through the empty street, carrying a scent that made Rick's heart leap. It was faint, so faint he almost thought he imagined it, but it was there. The scent of home. Rick's ears flattened as a surge of energy shot through his tired body. He turned sharply, following the scent through winding streets, past parked cars, through alleyways. His breath came in short, desperate pants as he ran, his paws skidding on the cold pavement. The world around him blurred. There was only one thought in his mind now: home. Then, suddenly, he saw it. A familiar house. A white porch, a red front door, the small potted plants on the steps. It was real. It was here. Rick's breath hitched, his vision blurred, but not from exhaustion this time. He took a slow, trembling step forward. Then another. He could see the living room window glowing warmly from inside. And then, the door opened. A woman stepped onto the porch, bundled in a thick sweater. She was holding a steaming mug of tea, her breath visible in the cold air, and then as if some invisible force had guided her, she looked down. Her eyes widened. The mug nearly slipped from her hands. "Rick?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but Rick heard it. He knew that voice. It was her. With a broken meow, Rick took off, sprinting toward her with everything he had left. The woman gasped, dropping to her knees just in time for Rick to throw himself into her arms. Warmth, familiarity, love. Tears streamed down her face as she held him close, her hands running over his thin body, his ragged fur. "Oh my God. Rick, is it really you?" Footsteps pounded from inside the house, then a second voice, deeper, choked with emotion. "Rick?" A man rushed out, his face pale with disbelief. Behind him a young boy appeared, his sleepy eyes widening in shock. "Rick!" The boy's scream shattered the night as he ran forward, throwing his arms around the cat. Rick felt himself buried in warmth, in love, in the safety he had been searching for. They were all here, his family. He had found them. Or maybe, they had found him. Tears, laughter, words of disbelief filled the cold night air. The woman, still crying, whispered, "We thought you were gone forever." But Rick was here. He had made it. 100 miles, days of suffering, nights of terror, but none of it mattered now, because he was finally home.